Hello everyone and welcome back. We're going to talk about Photoshop today. We've had a chat about Lightroom and the fundamentals of Lightroom and what all these tools mean and what you can do with them. And now we're going to talk about the basics of Photoshop. Photoshop is limitless to what you can do with it, and we're going to create endless videos on certain Photoshop techniques that you're going to love. But we're going to get to grips with the absolute basics of Photoshop. Too often people get into Photoshop and they think this is the most confusing thing, it's too much for me, I can't do it, because there's so much you can do. But we're going to simplify it to the most important features, which every photographer, if you've got Lightroom, you should have Photoshop. It comes with the same package and you should use it, and I'm going to show you why. This is the basics of Photoshop. Enjoy. So the first thing I'm going to talk about in Photoshop is that you should always have Lightroom and Photoshop linked. They are better than one and the other in certain elements of editing. So you should always have both of them. Lightroom is very good for cataloging and organizing. This is where your edits start. This is where you do the contrast adjustments, the color adjustments. It's much more effective at doing this, and you can organize your files at the same time. But every now and again, an image needs just a little bit more. That's where Photoshop comes in. So let's get into the basics of Photoshop. Firstly, we're in Lightroom. Like I said, this is where your edits start. All you have to do, because all of Adobe's products are linked, and you can work on one file or one project on different Adobe products at the same time and bring that file from one into the other until it's perfect, it makes your editing life that much more useful, that much more powerful. So all you have to do is right click and edit in Adobe Photoshop 2021. So like I said, we're going to discuss the basics of Photoshop and just get an understanding of how it works. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is layers and masking. This is the foundation of Photoshop. Down in this left-hand panel, you can see you've got your first layer. This is what you've brought through from Lightroom. This is your baseline, and you can stack up as many different layers as you want here and edit each layer individually. This is the difference between Photoshop and Lightroom. Lightroom, every time you edit, you stack edits upon edits, and you can't come back and change that original edit that you put in or any edits before your last edit without affecting the entire image. Photoshop always gives you the ability to affect each edit and each layer separately, no matter what's on top of each layer. So if you made a mistake on one of your original ideas or your original edits, you can come down to that layer and change it accordingly. Let me show you what that looks like. So over here we have our background layer. One of the first keyboard shortcuts I'm going to tell you is Command J. You use it a lot. That is duplicate layer. So if I go Command J, you can see it adds another layer exactly like this one on top of that layer, and I can Command J and add as many layers as I want. On the subject of layers, you can add different layers to this. So over here you have a panel which we're going to go through. Over here is add a new layer, but it's an empty layer. So create new layer. If I click all of these out, you can see there's nothing there. That's an empty layer. You can put anything you want on top of it. So back onto these little eyeballs, that hides and reveals the layer. Now if you were to save the file like this, it would come out as nothing. There's nothing there. It probably wouldn't even save. Even though these layers are still present and you can work with them, you've disabled that layer. So according to your export, it doesn't exist. So I'm going to click that back on and keep talking about layers for a little bit. So not only can we duplicate the same layer that we brought into Lightroom, we can add adjustments and effects onto that layer. So if I wanted to paint, let me get rid of the empty layer. If I wanted to paint on this, the most simplest way to do it is by brushing. You can see I can brush whatever I want. At the moment, the color is black over there, so I'm brushing black onto the layer. I'm going to Command Z. Command Z is another shortcut you need to know that undoes anything on a Mac. But I can also add adjustments to that layer on this icon over here. So as you can see, there's various options over here, and most of them are self-explanatory. Brightness and contrast is one you'll know from Lightroom. If I want to make the image brighter, if I want to make the image darker or brighter, this is where I do it. And as you can see, I've got a brightness layer. So I can come back. If I add another one of hue saturation and I do a little bit of hue stuff, and then I add a little photo filter, which let's add color filter blue and make it a little blue, and that looks like shit. Anyway, you can see all these layers start to build up, which means I can come back here to brightness and contrast, even though it's below all these layers, and adjust it accordingly. So I've always got control of those adjustments, even though I've added stuff on top of it. That's the difference between Lightroom and Photoshop. They're exactly the same, except with Photoshop you can come back to certain ideas and edits and change them later, even if you've added stuff on top of it. Lightroom you can't. It's top to bottom. Everything you add keeps piling up, and if you want to change something, you have to take all those layers away to get back to what you want to change and fix it. So that's what layers are. We're going to talk about masks now. This is the next important thing about Photoshop, because it allows us to hide and reveal parts of a layer. You can see every time I add an adjustment layer in this panel, whatever it might be, it comes with a mask. This is the white box next to the icon. So if I click on this layer and click on this little square over here, that is add layer mask. That's what these are. You can see I've added the white box there and I've added the white box there. Those are all layer masks, and what that allows you to do, like I said, is reveal or hide a layer. Now, if I get rid of all of these, because we've talked about layers now, let's get rid of them. You can just drag them and drop them into the bin like that. So now if I've got one layer on top of another, and let's say I've done adjustments to this top layer. Now I must say, when you add an adjustment layer, like just as it is affecting all the layers below. If I want it to just be applied to a single layer, I hold Alt and I hover between the two, and you'll see a square and an arrow, and you click, and now that is bound just to that layer. So if I affect the brightness, it'll just affect this layer. If I turn that layer off, like so, I've disengaged that layer, you can see the brightness hasn't been applied to this layer, which is still engaged. It's only been applied to the layer below it, because I told it to. Now what mask allows to do, like I said, is hide and reveal certain parts of a layer. So if I darken that whole layer with a brightness and contrast adjustment filter, but I didn't want it to be so dark on the leopard, this bottom layer still has a bright leopard. So if I click on this mask, now I can hide and reveal certain elements of this picture. Now, the trick here is to click B for brush. Brush is the brush function. Or you can just click up on this icon over here. It gives you various options, but we're going to just stick with the brush function for now. B, if you clicked on a mask, is not going to paint this color over here. It's slightly different. You have a mask selected in this corner, like so. So now, if black's on the top, it is going to hide the layer that you've selected on. If white's on top, if I click this arrow, it swaps it, white's on top, white will reveal. So if I click that back onto black and paint like this, you can see it's starting to reveal what's below it. In that little icon now, you can see black is hidden, white is revealed. So part of this bottom layer is starting to be revealed through this top layer. If I don't like it, I can click X or reverse it over here with this arrow, so white's on top, and paint that back again. And now I've revealed that layer, I've painted it away. And the bottom layer is hidden again. So if I click on a mask, and I'll show you that again, and click B for brush, and if black's on top, I'm now hiding part of this layer, which reveals the layer below it. That's what masks do. Very, very important. That's the fundamentals of Photoshop, is layers and masks, and understanding how they work. Now we're going to get into the most important shortcuts with Photoshop. These are the things that if you have Photoshop, you're going to use fairly commonly. We're not going to get into specifics with Photoshop just yet. We'll get into that at a later stage. This is the basics. This is why you should have Photoshop and not just Lightroom. And the first one, and the most important one I'm going to tell you about, is J, the J function. Now, we've spoken in Lightroom about the spot removal tool, how it clone stamps one area onto another area to hide a spot or something that you don't want in the frame. Now, can you imagine trying to do that with this image? If we look at here, if we look at this, there's this piece of grass heading straight through the middle of the frame, and you can remove them all in the same manner, but not with Lightroom. It's just not good enough. There'll be blotches and artifacts all over the place. So this is where J comes in. You just click J, or you click on the spot healing brush in the left-hand column over here, and you can adjust the size of your brush with your bracket keys like so, and make it bigger or smaller. You make it just bigger than the spot or line you want to remove, and it's as simple as painting over it like this, and it's gone, just like that. And you can do it all the way down. Obviously a face is a little bit more difficult, and we'll get into how to reconstruct a face at a later stage, but if I wanted all these sticks gone, I literally just paint over them with J, and they disappear. They work on content aware algorithms, and they're very effective it's very effective at getting rid of spots and lines and shapes that you don't want in your frame. That is probably the most common use for Photoshop. You have to get Photoshop just for the J function. It's that powerful. The next thing we're going to talk about is S, or clone stamping. If you hit the letter S, again, you get a circle like this, which you can make bigger or smaller with your bracket keys, or you click on the clone stamp tool in the left-hand column like this. And a clone stamp is what a clone stamp is. It's cloning one part of the frame onto another part of the frame. So if I wanted two leopards in this image, I would use the clone stamp tool. First thing you've got to realize is for most of these tools, you're going to have an opacity option up here. Now, if I were to just do this as is, you hold the Alt function, you click on what you want cloned, click, let go of the Alt function, and now you can clone that area into another part of the frame. But as you can see, I'm clicking and holding and nothing's happening because it's on 12% opacity. If I kick that up to 100, do the same thing, Alt, click, and now I get my second leopard. It's cloning that part of the frame into this part of the frame. So that's the clone stamp tool. We use that fairly often. The next thing we're going to talk about is V and H. Your fingertips are always going to be on the letter V and the letter H, because V is the move tool. If I zoom out and I click V, it is going to move whatever layer you have selected over here. So if I click V and start moving, you can see I'm moving this layer. And over here at the back, you can see the layer below it. As I said, layer by layer, it's stacked on top of each other. So V moves whatever layer you selected on around the frame. And the next thing I told you about is H. If I click Z, which is zoom, and I zoom in, H can move me around the frame, like so, without actually moving the layer from its original position. If I zoom out a bit, like so, and I click H, you can see I can move around the frame, but the layer itself doesn't move. I am moving. If I want to work on that corner, I use H and I come up to that corner, and then I move back, and I can come up to that corner. So your fingers are always on V and H and moving yourself around the screen. The last functions we're going to talk about is the select option in Photoshop. It has a multitude of different benefits, but we're going to just discuss about we're just going to discuss why it's important to know how to select in Photoshop. There's various options. There's the marquee tool in the left-hand column here. If you right-click on it, it gives you different shapes. Now, if I zoom into my image like so, and I want to select something, I click on that, and as you can see, it gives me a box of marching ants. Every time you see marching ants, it means you've selected something. Now, everything you do from this point onwards is going to happen in that selection. Remember when we talk about Command J, duplicate layer? If I go Command J now, you can see, let me get rid of these, delete those, we're not going to use them anymore. If I hide those, you can see I've just duplicated that part of the frame that I'd selected. So everything you do from that moment onwards, if you've got a selection, is going to happen only within that selection. So this becomes very useful. So if I get rid of that again, and I select that layer, and I want to select my leopard, and I just want edits inside that leopard, I can use either one of the selection functions. This is the second one I want to talk about. This is W, the letter W, or quick selection. There's two options here. There's object, well, there's three. I never really use the magic wand tool, so don't worry about that. There's the object selection tool and there's quick selection tool. These are both very useful. Object will try and select an object. Now this image isn't very sharp, so you drag a square over it and you hope that it selects the leopard. Let's see what it does. And as you can see, it hasn't quite selected the leopard as much as I would have liked. If I go Command J again, you can see I've just created another layer according to that selection. So if I click that all back again and pull that into the trash, we go to the other option, which is W, the letter W, and I right click on it and I click quick selection over here. And now I can actually try and quick select. It does its best. It does its best to find hard lines of contrast and stick between those lines. So if you're trying to select an object, if I just want to select the eyes like that, now I've got an eye selected. Now, again, like I've said before, if you've got something selected, everything's going to happen within that selection. So if I add an adjustment layer, brightness, contrast, and I increase the brightness, you can see I've just increased the brightness of the eye alone. A mask comes up, everything in black is deselected, and just the eye, which you can barely see, is selected. So that's the selecting process. And the last thing to talk about with selecting is you can refine your selection. Obviously, you'd want it to be as close as possible. When you're dealing with hairs or lines main, you want it to be as close as possible. So whether you're on N, the marquee tool up here in the top left, or on W, the quick selection tool, the object selection tool over here, either one of these tools, if you're selected on them, gives you this option up here, which is called select and mask. If I go to the object selection tool like this, and I select my leopard again, and I want to have my edits only inside my leopard. I just want to add brightness and contrast to my leopard alone, nothing else. I want it to be exactly around my leopard. And as you can see, these selection functions do the best they can. The sharper the object, the better. But because I'm on a selection option, I get this option up at the top, select and mask. If I click on that, it gives you an idea of what is selected and what's not selected. Red is not selected, neutral is selected. And it gives you a bunch of options over here. You can normally tick smart radius and add a little bit there, try and soften that edge a little bit. But the biggest thing is you've got the option of letter B and letter R. If you choose B, again, you can increase the size of your brush. If you just click and start brushing, you can see it starts to select more. You're choosing what's selected. If I click Alt, remember Alt is always the negative of something, it will deselect that area. Now, you can do this. It takes time, and you can select your whole leopard and go around the tail. We don't have enough time today. But the other function with selection, which is really important to know, especially because selecting stuff is one of Photoshop's most powerful tools, is the letter R. Now this only comes in handy when you're in the select and mask mode, like I've just shown you how to get into. And it's along edges like this where there's fur. It'll try and differentiate between sharp areas and soft areas and select the sharp areas. Now this leopard's not very sharp, so this might not work very well. But I go over the ear and it'll try and select the furs. If it doesn't work very well, I go back to brush and I brush that in, which means I'm selecting that area. Like so, and I get a little bit more of that area, a bit of that area. I go back to R, make it a little bit smaller, like that. The smaller it is, the more refined it's going to be. If it's too big, it'll start to deselect areas inside your subject. Go back to brush, make it a little bit smaller, brush away that bit of red, and now I've made a good selection of my leopard, and I'll go around my whole leopard doing this. Come back to the bottom, don't worry about any of this. Make sure selection is ticked, click OK, and now you've made a solid selection. This is the power of Photoshop. And now that I've made a solid selection, remember I can add an adjustment layer according to that selection alone. Or I can Command J like this, and now I've got a layer of just that leopard. And now I've got a layer of just the leopard like this. So if I add a brightness and contrast or levels or curves, let's do hue and saturation to that, and I click Alt and I want it to just apply to that layer, and I take the saturation down, you can see my leopard has become completely desaturated. So that's Photoshop. That's the basics of Photoshop. Once you're done here, the last thing you need to do is Command S. If I go Command S, you can see it's saving over here. And where does it save it back to? If I go back into Lightroom like so, you can see our new image comes back into our Lightroom folder. And that is saved as a TIFF file, which is a really big file with all the information that you've added in Photoshop, and still gives you lots of room to play around with in Lightroom. And that TIFF file has gone to the home file that we've created in cataloging and importing, so it's gone to the same place right next door to your original image. And now you can keep editing and organizing in Lightroom. So that's the power of Photoshop. If you don't have it, that's the fundamentals. It takes a little bit of getting used to. If it still doesn't make sense, give me a call. But no, we're going to use these basic techniques to create really beautiful images and apply it to images that you might think had no potential at all, and create works of art out of it. So that's Photoshop, that's the basics. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you for some more editing soon. Cheers.